everyone. I am incredibly pleased and honored today to introduce Professor Amy Kulper to you and to Rizzi. She is Assistant Professor at Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan. Received her PhD from Cambridge University with her dissertation on Victor Horta, and received 2 master's degrees, one from Cambridge University and the other one from University of UPenn, University of Pennsylvania, Master of Philosophy and Master of Architecture, consecutively. And she has, prior to joining University of Michigan's faculty, she taught at Bayard, Southern California Institute of Architecture, UCLA, UPenn, and Cambridge University. She has been a fellow at the Institute for the Humanities of University of Michigan, a highly prestigious fellowship. She has also received the Donna M. Seltzer Award for Teaching Excellence for 3 years. Is that a record? Which is, knowing Amy a little bit from UCLA and from Bayard comes as no surprise to me, because she's one of the most esteemed teachers. She was one of the most esteemed teachers in both of those schools. And actually, at Bayard, she was teaching, there was a sequence of courses called Architecture Culture 1 and Architecture Culture 2. And she was teaching the 1, which was the hard one, from like beginning to 19th centuries, and I was teaching the 2, which was the easy one, the 100 years following. And I remember the director of the graduate studies saying, well, just teach the follow-up to Amy's course. And I'm like that's easy, because it's one of the most difficult things, in the sense that she would prepare the students in a very good fashion, intellectually. Her work has been published in several books, including Experiments, Architecture Between Sciences and the Arts, Intimate Metropolis, Urban Subjects in the Modern City, and Visions of the Industrial Age, as well as in several journals such as Candid, Journal of Architecture, and Field. She is currently working on her book, which I can't wait to see and read, called Immanent Natures, the Laboratory as Paradigm for Architectural Production, which explores the conceptualization of the natural world and sciences in the discipline of architecture. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kulper to Rizzi.
Thanks, Tulay, for that incredibly generous introduction. And it's really nice to, can you all hear me okay? It's really nice to be here. This is my first visit, actually, to Rizzi, and Peter was kind enough this morning to take me to the nature lab, and I'm completely smitten. So now I need to get back and check out some bird skeletons or something. Thanks to both Tulay and Peter for the incredibly generous invitation to come and speak with you all. I want to present today, this is a piece of the first chapter of my book, and I was saying to Desmond and Ryan last night that this book, this manuscript, was developed while I was a fellow at the Humanities Institute at the University of Michigan, and that's an amazing institute where scholars from all different disciplines come together and sort of work on their manuscripts. And while it was an amazing experience for me, I was confessing to them last night that I was also really delighted to be back amongst architects and people for whom space is the medium. And so I'm really anxious. I've shared this with my colleagues at the Institute, but you all will be some of the first people outside of Michigan that I've shared some of the work from my book with you. So I'm anxious to hear your thoughts about it and your questions and arguments against it. So the title of my book is Immanent Natures, the Laboratory as Paradigm for Architecture's Experimental Practices. And what I'm interested in doing in the book is I think within the discipline of architecture there is a pretty standard narrative for science's involvement with the practice of architecture, and that has to do with the kind of institutional split in the 19th century between the École des Beaux-Arts and the École Polytechnique, and so one either studied architecture as a fine art or one studied architecture as an applied science. And I'm not so interested in that particular institutional division, but my book is really interested in trying to understand other kinds of scientific biases that have sort of ridden in on the coattails of various things that have entered the discipline of architecture. So I'm interested in not the part of architecture that's relegated to engineering per se, but I'm interested in all the ways in which we as a discipline of designers have learned some things, either things that we acknowledge that come directly from science, or things that simply become a part of our practice. And so that's essentially what my book explores. And the book is divided into, it looks at 3 different historical periods. It looks at the 19th century, the 1960s, and the contemporary. And then the structure of the book is based on the structure of a scientific laboratory. So it looks at the component parts of the scientific laboratory, the scientists, the laboratory itself, the kinds of taxonomies or ways of categorizing disciplinary knowledge, the tools that a scientist would use. And so it lays out those things as individual chapters. Now what I'm going to present to you today is actually from the first chapter of the book, and this is just a really kind of a close reading of a peculiar text by Viollet-le-Duc, a text that he produced on Mont Blanc. And so this is sort of the opening foray into the book, and I'm really interested in it because he characterizes Mont Blanc as a laboratory. And so this chapter is a little bit a microcosm for the rest of the book, because I'm trying to look at this through the lens of the same component parts of the laboratory as the larger book does. So let me also say, please feel free. I always much more enjoy doing this if you all have questions or comments as I go, or I'm not being particularly clear about something, please feel free to raise your hand, call out, whatever. It's always just good to know that you guys are there and engaged, so I'm happy to answer things as we go. In 1876, French architect, theorist, and restoration specialist Eugene Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc wrote a lengthy tome on Mont Blanc, on its geological and geodesical formations, on its transformations, and on the current and past states of its glaciers. Today, the question I want to consider is what would inspire a restoration architect to consider in excruciatingly tedious detail the natural creation of glaciers and moraines. I can tell you all that what I'm not going to recommend is that you run right out and borrow the book on Mont Blanc from the library, or Google has now made it available. But it is incredibly excruciating, the amount of detail about geological formation. And so it's a really interesting book in that most architectural historians don't spend the time with it, because it can be mind-numbingly boring if you're not so interested in geological formation. But I think there's something else, there's another story to be told there, and that's what got me fascinated with the text and its kind of tedious detail. So in the opening paragraphs of the book, Viollet reveals that being on the slopes of Mont Blanc is like being in a laboratory in which one can observe the gigantic operations of the natural world. Viollet's text is one of the earliest examples of the use of the laboratory paradigm in architectural discourse. And this lecture will examine the operations of this paradigm in Viollet's experimental theories. I want to link Violet's interest in the gigantic operations, those are his words, of the natural world, of its generative and creative capacities, to the romantic attitude towards nature earlier in the century, epitomized, I think, by this stanza from Percy Bysshe Shelley's poem about Mont Blanc. So here you can witness an elision between what he calls the secret strength of things, nature's generative capacities, which governs thought. And here I'm interested in the way in which he's painting nature as a contingency of human rationality, and operates universally as a law inhabiting the mountain. So through this act of personification, this moment when he says, which governs thought, Shelley is actively eliding human nature with nature's generative capacities. And this is what I will refer to as immanent nature. So this is the conceit of the book, is that I'm really interested in tracing a conceptualization of nature that makes nature a human contingency, right? It's contingent upon our ability to think rationally. It's contingent upon our ability to make things like nature makes them. And so really the larger intellectual history that I'm trying to trace is how do we come to think of nature as something that is contingent upon, that becomes a human contingency in that way. So as a little bit of a detour here, I want to point to a passage. I recognize some of you from being at Tony Vidler's lecture last evening, and I think that maybe this is a moment of real common ground between his current intellectual project and mine, and that is he's looking at a different Bruno Latour text, but I'm specifically interested in well, and he mentioned this one as well, We've Never Been Modern. So there's a passage by Latour in this book that he wrote in 1991 that has acted as both an irritant and an instigator to the research that I'm doing in this chapter. In it, he's discussing this other book here, The Leviathan and the Air Pump by Chapin and Schaefer. And basically, this is an amazing book, one of the best things I've read in maybe the last 10 years. The Leviathan and the Air Pump, not the, I mean, the Latour is good, but the Leviathan and the Air Pump is kind of amazing. And what the subject of that book is Thomas Hobbes and Robert Boyle, so a political theorist and a chemist. And one of the things that the authors do that's so amazing is that they reveal the fact that Boyle, the chemist that you all probably studied sometime back in high school chemistry, actually develops a political theory in his lifetime, and that Hobbes, whom you all probably took in some political science course at some point in your lives, actually was an experimentalist. And so the book looks at the way in which both of them both of their work, their research, finds cultural purchase. And one of the really interesting points that they make is that Hobbes, the political theorist, basically makes his point positivistically. He makes his point much more like a scientist would. Whereas Boyle, the chemist, makes his point by enlisting constituencies. He makes his point as a political theorist would. And so there's this beautiful way in which the book sort of inverts assumptions that we have about how political theory or scientists release their work into the world. But I want to get back to the thing that sort of nagged me and really caused me to think about writing this book myself. And that's a passage where Latour's commenting on this book, The Leviathan and the Air Pump, and he claims that chemist Robert Boyle gave us a modern language for speaking about nature. And as proof, he offers the terms experiment, fact, and evidence. So I want to argue, contrary to Latour, that what Boyle gave us was not a modern language for nature, but rather a modern language for scientific experiment. And Latour's claim comes at the cost of conflating science and nature such that science's techniques, the how of the experiment, how an experiment is conducted, is substituted for nature's content, the what. And so this is really the crux of my interest, the way in which these techniques, these hows of scientific procedure actually have become, I think in the contemporary moment, the sort of content of architectural discourse. And so I'm trying to work backwards and understand, well, how did that inversion happen? How did the how supplant the what? So what makes that sleight of hand possible? Like how can we possibly substitute the how for the what? You're looking at images of blood crystals represented by the 19th century physiologist Otto Funk, in which each depiction of a blood specimen preserves the instrumentality of the magnifying lens through which it's observed. So I'm interested in the way in which these samples here actually preserve the instrument itself, right? You're always cognizant when you're looking at the samples of the fact that you're seeing it, you're being conditioned by the instrument. Such that it becomes easy to suppress the instrumental framework through which the research operates. So once you isolate a specific example like this, the instrument itself is missing from this operation, but the instrumentality it lives on. And so I'm really interested in that as one of the critical moments where the how begins to supplant the what, right? But all of a sudden, we're no longer fully understanding when we look at this image, oh yeah, he's seeing those blood crystals through a microscope. And that moment of being able to sort of occlude the instrument, I think is critical to understanding why the how became somehow more important than the what. So, returning to Violet and his research on Mont Blanc, it's possible to argue for a similar conflation of scientific method and natural content, or an eclipse of the latter by the former. For as architectural historian Martin Bressani states, the relationship between architecture and science can never be a productive metaphor in Viollet-le-Duc's work, because metaphors require an inherent distance. And in the case of Violet's Alpine laboratory, what we're witnessing is an elision. So again, because Violet looks at these mountains and says, well, when I look at these mountains, I see a laboratory, there's no distance. He's not saying the mountains are like a laboratory, he's saying they are a laboratory. And I'm really interested in the way that Bressani understands those two things to be sort of collapsed on top of one another. And again, I think this is the other way in which we're importing scientific biases into the discipline unwittingly. So at stake for the discipline of architecture in this proximity is the question of whether architectural knowledge can be described scientifically as an epistemology, or whether it is attributable to the practical wisdom of the architect. And for me, this is a question of situated knowledge versus emancipated knowledge. Or perhaps more directly, it's a question of whether all knowledge can be made explicit and classified, or following somebody like philosopher Michael Polanyi, if it's possible to argue that the architect also possesses tacit knowledge, a kind of knowledge of the hand. And so this maybe is the crux of the question for all of you as makers. And maybe when I introduced myself, I should have told you that I'm an architect by training first, and then a historian theorist. And so I'm really interested primarily as someone who's trained to make space. And so this question of whether the knowledge of our discipline is a knowledge that is an emancipated knowledge, like we can just categorize it and disseminate it, we can transfer it that way, or whether it's a tacit knowledge. Is it a knowledge of the hand? And Peter and I spoke a little bit this morning about two kinds of scientific knowledge, and I think this is really where my work is touching on that subject of these two different kinds of knowledge. With respect to the laboratory paradigm, my talk will interrogate Violet's text about Mont Blanc from 5 constituent vantage points: the laboratory, things and taxonomies, techniques, tools, and the scientists. And those are also the 5 subsequent chapters of the book. So first to the laboratory, and in this section I'm calling Untethered. In her 1984 book, Voyage into Substance, Barbara Maria Stafford discusses the advent of 18th century meteorological and climatological laboratories that were housed in balloons. So if I'm arguing that the laboratory is the locus in which the natural world is framed as a human contingency, then the moment it becomes untethered, it is both distant from any situation or place and simultaneously myopically ensconced within the phenomena it's observing. So I'm interested in the way in which these weather clouds that Stafford talks about they would be studying climate, but from the vantage point of being totally ensconced in that climate, right? And the problematic of both assuming a kind of scientific distance with respect to that subject, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, just being enveloped within the subject on the other. Stafford reminds us that in France, where these weather balloons were first deployed, the same word is used to describe this aerial experience and the practice of scientific experiment. And this is one of the amazing things that you can see in the scientific etymological dictionaries of the 19th century, is the way in which the term experience comes, the scientific connotation of experiment begins to eclipse actual experience. And I think that this is also what I'm trying to get at in this work on Violet. So the opening chapter of Violet's Mont Blanc text is almost entirely consumed by descriptions of his own methods. I mean, I guess it's following the great example of the heroic architect that the first chapters are all about Violet and all about what his methods were and how he sort of unleashed these methods on Mont Blanc. So what tools he used, what representational conventions he deployed, which maps he consulted, how he aggregated and synthesized this information. And I think, like Caspar David Friedrich's painting, in which the natural world is the ostensible subject, but human nature is the obvious preoccupation. So again, this is this elision of the natural and human nature that I'm so interested in, right? Like, presumably for Caspar David Friedrich, it's the prospect that we're the natural prospect that we're interested in, but we know that Romanticism, in fact, is interested in the sort of psychological toll of examining that prospect. And so again, for me, that's an immanent nature that becomes human contingency. What we really wonder when we see the wanderer is what he's thinking, like what his emotional landscape is. And I think Violet's early forays onto Mont Blanc reveal a kind of similar preoccupation. By way of explanation for why an architect would write such a text, Violet offers the following. Quote, "To analyze carefully a group of mountains, the manner in which they were formed, and the causes of their ruin, to discover the order in which the phenomena of upheaval occurred, the conditions in virtue of which they have resisted or endured the action of atmospheric agents, To note the chronology of their history is to devote oneself to a work of methodical analysis which is, on a grand scale, analogous to that which the practical architect and archaeologist applies himself when drawing conclusions from the study of buildings. So this is a pretty loaded passage, but I'm really fascinated by the fact that he really sees the work of a climatologist and a geologist as being like the work of the practical architect or archaeologist. And I think that specifically I was drawn to the connotation of the practical architect, because this is where I think these two kinds of knowledge that I have set out in the beginning of this talk really, the question of tacit knowledge or knowledge of the hand versus an epistemological understanding or a kind of emancipated knowledge that can be disseminated anywhere. Those two knowledges, bodies of knowledge, I think are embedded in this figure of the practical architect. So, sorry, I just lost my place here. So while it would be tempting to see the intimate perspective of this drawing of the mountain by Ville as an extension of the romantic conceptualization of the natural world captured by Friedrich, I think there are also some really significant differences. In this sculpture of nature unveiling herself before science, the green seraph, this piece that you see here, indicates that the figure is Isis, the Egyptian and later Greek matron of nature. For the Romantics, she was a seminal figure, and Novalis and others described the terror that awaited anyone who dared lift the veil of Isis and gaze into her eyes, for to know nature's secrets was tantamount to death. Here, in Barrias's figure, and you can see this sculpture was done in 1899, so quite a bit of time has transpired between Novalis's kind of romantic retelling of the story of Isis and Barrias's depiction here. We see nature willingly reveal herself before the scientific gaze, as if to say, the scientific gaze, as if to say that to be untethered, to occupy a balloon in the atmosphere or a mountaintop some 15,000 feet above sea level, or to simply be within the hermetic confines of the laboratory, is to simultaneously be removed from a specific locale and to be thrust into the phenomena of that place. And in that moment, science becomes privy to nature's secrets. So I think there's something happening here with this Isis figure that she's sort of willingly now revealing her secrets to science. Giorgio Agamben, in his book, The Signature of All Things, defines a paradigm as a model that facilitates the relationship between any specific example and the exemplar or the broader category to which it belongs. And in the untethered laboratory, we witness a movement from the specific site of Mont Blanc to a detached and universal site of scientific method and procedure. And it is in this movement that the paradigm of the laboratory emerges from Ville's writing. And just as a footnote to this discussion of the laboratory, well, I mean, first I should say that I'm showing you here in this image the Janssen Observatory on Mont Blanc, but it was a pretty common practice in the 19th century to build observatories on these major peaks to study climate. And in fact, on Mont Blanc, Gustave Eiffel was consulted to see whether he would actually be willing to architect or engineer an observatory there, and he refused. He said that the ground condition wasn't stable enough, and that he wouldn't build one. But you are looking at one that was built, and the observatory was constructed there in 1893. And in the middle image, you can see the astronomer Pierre Janssen at age 68 being transported to the site via a method of transport that already renders him untethered from the site of the mountain. And in the last image, you're actually seeing the observatory fell into a crevasse. So this is, I suppose Eiffel was right about this, but I think that there is a beautiful way in which Janssen's transport to the site still reveals this idea of the laboratory being somehow untethered. I now want to shift from a discussion of the laboratory to the scientific classification of things and their taxonomies. And I want to do so by quickly examining two maps of Mont Blanc. The map on the left by an Italian cartographer that appears in a Sardinian atlas, the one on the right by a French cartographer, drawn just 11 years prior to the publication of Violet's text, and which the Italians refer to as the Great Lie. In the Italian version, the geopolitical boundary is demarcated by a line that runs, I think, pretty fairly across the summit of the mountain range and divides the territory fairly evenly between Italy and France. In the French version, the range of mountains belongs in its entirety to France. So Violet refers in his text to this annexation, and I want to draw parallels between this geopolitical designation of territories and the disciplinary boundaries of architecture, archaeology, geology, and climatology in Violet's text as one way of asking the question of which disciplinarity this book is demonstrating, right? So I'm simply asking, like, who is Violet when he writes this text? Is he being an architect? Is he being a restoration architect? Does he think he's a geologist? We know that he's an accomplished alpiner, so is it from that vantage point? Like, who does he think he is as he produces the text, and does it belong to a specific set, a specific disciplinary knowledge set? And so here I'm showing you the Diderot's famous classification of knowledge as one example of this problem. So one operative taxonomy of architecture is that of representational conventions. And here I want to consider the convention of the dotted line and how it is employed in Violet's architectural drawings. Typically, and I know I'm just telling you all something that you all know, the dotted line is an architectural convention of representation that references the unseen. So if I were to draw a reflected ceiling plan of this room, I would draw what appears on the ceiling entirely out of dotted lines, because the convention of plan making is that you make a horizontal cut and look down on what you've cut through, and anything that exists behind that cut line then becomes represented as a dotted line. So I know this is review for all of you, but similarly, in this example of a wall section by Violet, both measure and the constructional logic of the wall, unseen by the naked eye, are rendered in dotted lines, whereas the material condition and appearance of the wall are rendered in solid lines. So I'm trying to take a convention that is typical to architects and try to understand whether we can find our way into what disciplinarity Violet is exercising when he does this work as a kind of amateur geologist and climatologist. And so I want to follow the dotted line through these various things. So this is actually the first image in Violet's Mont Blanc text. And it's significant, I think, because Violet opts to represent nature's behavior prior to representing nature's appearance. Here he's showing the process of geological formation. And the dotted line once again represents the unseen. In this case, it delineates nature's generative capacity as a before and after condition in which geological strata undergo the processes of upheaval. So if this drawing So just to be clear, the way he represents upheaval is that the dotted line becomes the datum, and you begin to understand that this dotted line is related to this dotted line, and you're seeing this lower level, an upheaval of the lower level, and the dotted line remains the datum to basically foreground nature's generative capacity. So if this drawing represents architectural conventions brought to geology, then in this drawing, we witness the operations of the archaeologist and restoration architect brought to a similar task. The dotted line here connotes the speculative prior form of the mountain and subsequent, and this is a quote, method through which ruin is effected. Again, the eye of the restoration architect wants to see what the mass of the mountain once looked like, and now what the mass of the mountain looks like as a result of various processes of ruination, of geological ruination. So here we see the temporal manipulation of the restoration architect's imagination that projects retroactively in order to discover a prior logic of construction, or of an archaeologist who observes a fragment and speculatively anticipates the whole to which it must have belonged. And this is certainly a factor in these drawings of the Notre Dame Cathedral in Dijon, for which Violet acted as the restoration architect. So here you're looking at the section as is, simply his documentation of what the wall section was. And here, Violet sees through the wall section, anticipating its constructional logic and simultaneously incrementalizing and taxonomizing the parts and process of its original creation. To be clear, this is both a logic of parts and how they go together, but also a formalization of the process of construction in which the activity is incrementalized. And I think in this sense, Violet is anticipating certain kinds of ergonomic developments that we see in the early 20th century. So Fordism, Taylorism, the way in which understanding something through the logic of its assembly led to the production of the modern assembly line. And I think these are beautiful early examples of that logic. Something different is at stake, however, in this drawing. Gone is the logic of rational construction, here replaced by the exuberance of the generative forces manifest in the spring point of a typical medieval arch. Here, as a result of Violet placing natural and human creation on an equal footing, we witness his curiosity about the natural world's creative capacities, manifested as a virtue in architecture's structural expression. Violet scholar Martin Bressani draws parallels between Violet's scientific gaze and that of 19th century anatomist Xavier Bichat. Bichat introduced to pathological anatomy what's known as the tissue theory, which allowed the medical gaze to see the human body as a system of organs enveloped by tissues. So prior to Bichat, anatomists would look at each organ individually and try to understand their relationship to one another. But with the introduction of the tissue theory, Bichat essentially systematized anatomical thinking, and one began to understand each organ's function as a part in that larger system. In The Birth of the Clinic, Foucault credits Bichat with the systematizing of life and death, so that there was no longer an arbitrary epistemological line separating the two, but rather death invaded the system of tissues long prior to the actual fact of dying, and manifest itself in various conditions of the corpse long after the event. So basically what Foucault's saying is, like, before Bichat, like, you were either alive or you were dead, and the epistemological line was pretty clear, and that by virtue of the kind of systematic understanding that Bichat introduced, that one could begin to anticipate the failure of the systems of various organisms prior to death. So you could see death in a living organism, and you could also see life in a dead organism. And so there's something quite compelling about what Bichat was able to do for the practices of comparative anatomy. Here I raise the analogy because between Violet and Bichat, because some of Violet's architectural and geological representations are interested in more than simply formalizing the processes of architectural and natural creation. Sometimes they simply celebrate the vital generative force of immanent natures. And this discussion of formalizing the process of creation provides, I think, a useful segue from the taxonomies and things belonging to the laboratory paradigm to the kinds of techniques that the laboratory instantiates. Architectural historian Ed Eigen, whom you all, I think, have read for today, details the emergence of the laboratory from the domestic setting through the double meaning of occupation as both an intellectual orientation and inhabitation. That is, in the locus of the home, science becomes an occupation. It becomes a profession. But also, our occupation of the home, the customs and habits we practice there, become the subject of scientific inquiry. And that's, as I showed earlier, that's etymologically preserved in French in the term expérience, but it's also, there's also a similar corollary that happens in the German language in the 19th century between two terms for experience, Erlebnis and Erfahrung. And so there is a way in which this new kind of modern scientific experience that the experiment occasions is beginning, I think, to eclipse what we all understand as lived experience. And it's interesting that languages then begin to produce terms for this new form of experience. This is a critical moment for my research because in it we witness the how eclipsing the what. Technique is a kind of emancipated knowledge, a know-how that may have emanated from the domestic setting, but promptly becomes preoccupied with its own operations and becomes forgetful of its origins. Once again, what's at stake is the question of whether architectural knowledge is epistemological, whether it can and should be understood as a universal science of experience, or whether the situational specificities of site, inhabitants, and culture still matter to the practical wisdom of the architect. Eigen observes that in those early domestic laboratories, often, so these last two images, there are a whole series of images in the 18th and 19th century that depict alchemical laboratories in the home. And what's interesting is depending on the period, like in the 19th century, they're kind of lionized. And in the 18th, not uniformly, as some of these will show, but in the 18th century, they were always shown through a pejorative lens, like they were counter to the logic of the Enlightenment, and so the alchemist was always seen as somebody who was like ruining his family, ruining his home, but it also shows the kind of domestic origin of scientific practice that I think Eigen spoke so eloquently about in the article that we all read. So that, I think, leads into these images. Eigen observes that in these early domestic laboratories, often the table where dissections were performed is also the primary dining table. And these two images from Diderot and D'Alembert's encyclopedia depicting On your left, a chemist working in the laboratory, and on the right, an embroiderer working in her home, epitomize for me what I'm calling this crisis of technique. Even though the practices of chemistry and embroidery couldn't be more different, they're depicted almost identically through the conventions of the discursive image. So we see the tables as parallel fields of operation, and the implements and instruments are taxonomized in such a way that the technique is foregrounded while the content of each experience recedes from our view. I mean, and this is sort of a, now that the encyclopedia is online, this is sort of a game that I like to play, which is to, flip through the plates and see if you can actually tell without looking at the descriptors what's going on. And there is a way in which the taxonomy of this discursive image that's simply showing you, breaking down for you the process of creation, overrides in a way the content. And so it becomes increasingly difficult, first of all, to recognize this as a domestic setting, but secondly, to be fully aware of what the practice is that's being documented. And again, for me, that is a moment of the how eclipsing the what. There's a pretty famous article that Leo Steinberg wrote on the flatbed printer, which also, I think, for me, enters into this thinking, where he's talking about the work of Rauschenberg and Dubuffet in the 1960s, and the moment in which something which is printed on a flatbed printer is all of a sudden set up vertically on a wall. And the way in which that printing process, which, the horizontality of that printing process, which is so much a part of something when it is a horizontal surface, that when it's tilted up, all of a sudden the how of how that thing is made becomes the content of the experience of encountering that thing. And so this is in my mind about, is this the precursor to what Steinberg is talking about in the flatbed printer? Is this a similar process that we're seeing unfold here? I mentioned that the first chapter of Violet's book about Mont Blanc is consumed by elaborations of his own scientific process. And in this image, we see that the key to understanding his elision of generative nature and human nature is mathematics. Not one of these four images is an actual view of Mont Blanc, but rather Violet has captured an ideal geometric form and morphologically regressed the image in order to capture the geological disintegration of crystalline rocks. It's important to contextualize this regression within the framework of the temporally elastic imagination of the Restoration architect that regresses for the sake of projection, right? So if you're a Restoration architect, you want to imagine what it was like back in the time so that you can project that reality in the contemporary moment. And here I'm arguing mathematics becomes the vehicle for the appropriation of nature's generative capacities. So you all are probably maybe more familiar with somebody like John Soane's archaeological imagination and the renderings that Gandhi did for Soane. And I think there is a kind of similar question to be asked here in Violet's work. Whoops. In this sense, the expressionist ambitions of Bruno Taut's early 20th century Alpine architecture owes a debt of gratitude also, I think, to Violet. Its emulation of the formation of crystalline structures as the ultimate embodiment of natural expression is the anticipatory complement to Violet's retroactive imagination. And I don't know how much any of you follow contemporary scientific debates about the Anthropocene, but there's a pretty famous scientist named Paul Crutzen who has basically said, has made an argument that in the industrial age, that man became a critical factor, humans became critical factor in climatological and geological evolution. And again, for me, this is another example of immanent natures, right? This is that contingency of the natural world on human practices that I'm trying to get at with this notion of immanent natures that I'm tracking. We witness the influence of the mathematical appropriation of the creative capacities of the natural world in the gigantic operations of geological formation that Ville is witnessing, but also in his more minute observations about blue ice and its process of regulation and compression, in which this image and this image both represent the same process. So this image on the left, he's just looking at this, he's basically asking what happens when snow melts and then it refreezes. This is the process of regulation. And here he's actually looking and observing that this is what it looks like. And on the right, he's mathematizing in a way. He's giving mathematical expression to his understanding of that process. For me, this is an interesting example of, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Richard Sennett's a recent book, The Craftsman, but there's a really beautiful argument that Sennett makes. He's talking about Galileo and Galileo's astronomical observations, and he says that basically at some point the lens technology in Galileo's time wasn't good enough for him to be able to make the observations that he ultimately made. And so Sennett introduces a concept that he calls the repair. And he says that basically what happened for Galileo is that the lens technology sort of stopped and couldn't figure things out by observation. And so the repair meant that he had to jump disciplines. He had to jump disciplines to mathematics to be able to make the kind of astronomical hypotheses that he wanted to make. And so I think we see a pretty similar moment in Ville of like, here's where observation left him, but he's now also trying to understand what a kind of mathematization of what he's observing would produce. And I would argue he's using the architectural imagination to try to get at that. And in this image, in which he's talking about the disintegration of rhombohedrons, where it's both topologically situated down here, and then mathematically emancipated above. And so you see this kind of constant tension in the imagery about, like, first of all, trying to understand what it is he sees, and then trying to understand the mathematical processes of its formation, as if one could understand those mathematical processes, one could then create like nature. And I think that this is the crux of the dilemma. Ville's diagram of the planes of contraction is the most abstract diagram in the book. And his mapping of the geological forces that contributed to the formation of one of Mont Blanc's amphitheaters is reminiscent of Darcy Wentworth Thompson's later mathematization of complex organic forms, and his aphoristic assertion that form is a diagram of its forces. And I think in a way that this is a kind of precursor. I don't know if this book makes similar rounds here, but when Tulay and I were at UCLA together in that moment when the blob was being kind of trotted out and digital fabrication was well underway there, this book became something of a Bible because Darcy Wentworth Thompson understood how to mathematize really complex forms. And for architects, that was a real seduction, because if you can mathematize those forms, then you can produce them digitally, right? So again, this has to do with this notion of incrementalizing the process of something's formation in order to understand, then to yield a kind of productive knowledge about it. Similarly, Ville's attempt to taxonomize matter that undergoes a change of state is a formalization of experience of another sort, and anticipates, I think, Henri Bergson's vitalist assertion that form is only a snapshot of a transition. So I sent this image to Lai and Peter because it's my favorite image from the book, and I think the desperation of wanting to taxonomically express something that is a moving target, for me, epitomizes the frustration that VLA must have encountered in this book of like trying to understand epistemologically something that he, as a restoration architect, probably understands as a kind of tacit knowledge or knowledge of the hand. And he's finding that translation between the two to be difficult or problematic. From technique, I want to now continue to a consideration of tools, and in particular the teleiconograph, a tool invented by another French architect just a few years prior to VLA's publication of the text, and one that VLA deployed in his mapping of the Alpine territory. These two images that I'm going to show you of the teleiconograph are from other, VLA never represents the tool himself, and so these are from other books at the time that describe what the apparatus is. Essentially, the tool consists of a telescope attached to a camera obscura, in which the rays of light are gathered by the telescope, and instead of being delivered directly to the eye, are refracted by the camera obscura and delivered to a table like this one below the eyepiece. Now, this is the only image within the text in which VLA explicitly mentions his use of the tool in the construction of the image, which I think is really perplexing given how coarse and rudimentary this image is compared with all of the others, right? Like, it looks like VLA drew it with his foot. And that got me really fascinated. Like, why would this be the only, it's by far the worst image in the least finished image in the book. I don't know about worst. It's by far the crudest image in the book. And so why would you call out, in this case, the fact that, you know, here's the image that was made with this pioneering piece of technology, the teleiconograph, in this moment. I want to, I don't know if you all have had a chance to read Peter Gallison and Lorraine Daston's recent book, but in their book they describe a debate that happened between two 19th century figures, Ernst Haeckel, who you all might know because he coined the term ecology, and Wilhelm His. And one of the things that they talk about, His and Haeckel had this raging debate because His used photography to document what he saw under the lens of a microscope. And Haeckel, you probably know Haeckel either because he coined the term ecology or because you know his unbelievably beautiful drawings of Medusa jellyfish and other things. And so His accused Haeckel of basically hijacking his own personal biases into the scientific process of observing things, right? So the idea was that the camera, His says, could record things objectively, and the fact that Haeckel is interpreting what he sees under the lens of the microscope is totally biasing what it is, the kind of scientific information that Haeckel is disseminating. And that debate, for me, is important when looking at an image like this one taken with a teleiconograph. And so I want to introduce and use this tool and the earlier part of my discussion that had to do with preserving the instrumentality of the microscope in the Otto Funk examples, to discuss what historians of science Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison refer to as epistemologies of the eye. In their seminal text, Objectivity, they identify three epistemologies of the eye. The first is truth to nature, and that's just like the teleiconograph that I've just shown you, simply records what is observed. The second is mechanical objectivity. So for example, in this middle image, which is, so the first image is an example of truth to nature, the snowflake. The second example is an example of mechanical objectivity. So in this atlas of snowflakes that this is taken from, the author of the atlas removed all of the abnormal snowflakes. He just decided that if they were abnormal, they didn't have a place in the atlas. And so that becomes a form of mechanical objectivity. You can see that that's an epistemology of the eye. He's not just showing you what he sees, he's deciding all the perfect snowflakes make it into the atlas, all the imperfect snowflakes are excluded as abnormal. And then the third one is trained judgment. The belief that the scientist's eye is trained to know what to include and what to exclude from any classification. So from left to right, these epistemologies of the eye move from one extreme of scientific realism to another of scientific constructionism. So on the one side, all you're being given is the real, and on the other side, all you're being given is a kind of constructed version of that reality. So realism is the belief that scientists merely record nature as it presents itself, and the constructionist framework is epitomized by Gaston Bachelard's aphorism, facts are made. They're social constructions. So there are times when Violet's drawings vacillate between the realist truth to nature and the constructionist trained judgment that sees through the decorative surface to the constructional logics of the table beneath it. And other moments in which he epitomizes mechanical objectivity as when he encourages students of drawing to depict nature that is geometrically idealized and to willfully ignore and eliminate all abnormalities and deformations. If in these instances Violet's tools appear to narrow creative possibilities, it's worth noting that he also has speculative tools in his arsenal. Philosopher Hans Weinger describes one such scientific instrument under the rubric of the heuristic fiction. Using Goethe's Erbpflanze, there's an image of it there in the middle, which Eigen also discussed briefly in the text that I shared with you all. Goethe called the Erbpflanze the kind of primordial plant, and he basically floated this as a heuristic fiction, a fiction of discovery. And the idea was Goethe never thought that there was a primordial plant that all plants emanated from, but he launched this heuristic fiction, and Weinger argues that this heuristic fiction led to the discovery of evolutionary theory, that a fiction was launched, it was understood to be a fiction, and that by working out and around the fiction, that the theory of evolution then emerged, and then the fiction could just be discarded because it had done its purpose. It had operated as a heuristic within the discipline of science. So similarly, Violet designed a hall that spanned an incredible 140 feet in width, using the construction techniques of the ancient Greeks and Romans, but designed as if these ancient civilizations had iron components available to them. And so I'm saying that this is a similar kind of heuristic fiction, right? This notion as if these iron components were then available. Whoops, sorry. So Violet writes, but it will be objected, what proofs can you furnish of the stability of the system indicated here? It is merely hypothetical, granting its ingenuity. You give us no experimental proof of its practicability. As it is not in my power to build a hall of these dimensions to prove the excellence of this system, I can only maintain it by my reasoning. And so I think that's a perfect example of him understanding this to be the heuristic that it is within the discipline of architecture. So I want to conclude with the question of how Violet self-identified. Did he consider himself to be a scientist? And I want to pursue this question by examining the various formats through which he disseminated his ideas. Villay was an incredibly prolific human being, as evidenced by his 10-volume treatment of all aspects of Romanesque and Gothic architecture in the Dictionnaire raisonné. His was an encyclopedic treatment of the architectural past, and in this project, Villay classifies architectural knowledge as epistemological, and in this sense configures himself as a scientist. So he basically says in this text, here are all the examples of Romanesque and Gothic architecture, and I'm arguing, saying that in this case, disciplinary knowledge of the architect is epistemological. Like, we can say what it is, it's deliverable to other people through the vehicle of the encyclopedia. Building upon this scientific premise, Villay also published his Entretien de l'architecture, 10 essays that embody Villay's theory of architecture. So from the experimental premise of the dictionary comes the very possibility of architectural theory. So I'm sort of saying that the dictionary becomes the kind of ground for his work, and then that ground allows a kind of theoretical exploration in the Entretien. He also produced 3 histories. The History of Human Habitation, an incredibly racist tome in which human habitation is treated equally as a science and a history, and in which human action is configured as historical agency. The History of a Designer, which is a thinly disguised Bildungsroman, a kind of predecessor to the autobiography, about the education of a young peasant by an engineer. And The History of a House, translated as how, interestingly translated, I think, as How to Build a House. And again, this particular attention on the how there. A novelette/technique manual about a schoolboy who designs a country house under the tutelage of his cousin, an architect significantly named Eugene. Villay's discursive production stretched between the scientific desire to merely record natural behaviors and the ambition of an architectural theorist who wanted to posit hypothetical and experimental possibilities. And in his work, we witness the elision of scientific experiment and aesthetic experimentalism, mediated through the paradigm of the laboratory. In his writings, we witness the seeds of the modern aesthetic manifesto as a manifestation of theoretical self-evidence that leaves its signature and trace on each of his scientific representations of the Mont Blanc text. In Villay's Alpine Laboratory, the gigantic operations of the natural world are framed as human contingency and appropriated mathematically. His writings become a fertile ground for propagating alternative narratives for science's influence upon architectural design. In the Alpine Laboratory, the possibility for a science of architecture confronts the practical wisdom of the architect, and this altercation constitutes the threshold to and dictates the terms of contemporary architectural debates. Thank you.
Can you repeat that last sentence?
Yes. Starting with in the Alpine Laboratory?
Sure.
In the Alpine Laboratory, the possibility for a science of architecture confronts the practical wisdom of the architect. And this altercation constitutes the threshold to and dictates the terms of contemporary architectural discourse. Are you going to make me eat my words now?
No.
Sure. I'm happy to answer questions if you all have some. Yeah.
I wonder if you can help me locate this within the rest of Viollet-le-Duc's work in terms of how long he was studying in Mont Blanc and if this was extended over like while he was working on other projects, or did he like retreat to the mountains for a while to gather himself? And what did he say about this in his own body of work?
Yeah, it's a great question. He did the heavy lifting for this work over a 5-year period, and but before that, he was a committed mountaineer, and so there are kind of history of figures in this period who were alpine enthusiasts. Ruskin would be the other really well-known one, and who belonged to alpine clubs and who continued to enjoy these places and have them somehow influence their architectural imaginations. But I would say that Ville distinguishes himself in particular by being the most kind of scientifically minded. You know, if you look at how Ruskin's alpine experience influenced what he wrote, it has more to do with questions of material imagination than it does with questions of his ability to practice the mountain scientifically. And so he doesn't, Ville doesn't write about about how this work influenced his other work, and that's why I am producing this kind of funny genealogy in the end, because you're asking a question that I'm incredibly interested in. So first of all, you know, is he self-identifying as a scientist in the Mont Blanc text? And then if he is, how does that fit into the larger constellation of his work? And so what I'm trying to say with this body of work is that the encyclopedic work that he did in the Dictionnaire Raisonné is like the platform for it. Like, he's done the encyclopedic thing, he's delivered the epistemological knowledge of this period. That then allows a kind of theoretical moment in the Entretien, where he now takes that ground that he's constructed and he says, okay, I've established that, and now I can begin to think theoretically. And then that gives way to thinly coded histories that are really autobiographies, and that I'm incredibly interested in, because for me, that autobiographical moment is where this notion of immanent natures, the combining of human nature and nature as we see it out there, it becomes a real autobiographical project for Ville. So in that moment, in these thinly disguised autobiographies that he's writing that are quasi-fictitious, I think there's another moment of him, you know, the conceit of an autobiography is, can you imagine yourself living in someone else's shoes? And I think that sets up the possibility of, could he imagine himself living in the shoes of a geologist and amateur geologist and climatologist in the Mont Blanc text. And then this malleable notion of history, and finally culminating in a kind of how-to book that's also masquerading as a novel. I think you can see where the influence of the Mont Blanc text sort of is touched on in each piece of this enterprise. But it's a really, what I say to my colleagues and other architectural historians, well, the first chapter of my book is on this Mont Blanc text. They all say, what Mont Blanc text? Because it's tedious. It's got a lot of geological detail to plow through, and so I think because of that, there is no kind of definitive account of where this text fits in the body of Ville's larger work. So this is my positioning of the text, because Ville himself doesn't say this is how this text influenced me.
I wonder though if this genealogy should also include his work on military architecture, the history of the castle, and geopolitics of missiles.
Yeah.
Missile movement, which is also of a large scale.
Yeah.
And the dissemination of, the breakup of a city according to new military technologies and so on.
Yeah, well, it would be, I think, also really interesting from the vantage point of the representational arguments that I'm trying to make
Exactly.
here, because
Similar to
yeah. So yeah, thank you. I will, but I will,
Can I continue?
yeah, please, please.
So the other thing that I am thinking of is I have like the same. I have looked at the geographical discourses at the same time,
Yeah.
and there's a very interesting text by a geographer called Elisabeth who is related. The reason I know him is he's related to Vidal de la Vache, who's related to Choisy, who was reading all these texts along with Violet. It's called a history of a mountain, Histoire d'une montagne,
Uh-huh.
where he talks about the architecture of the mountain. And that's going to lead me to my question where you're describing Violet architecting nature, geography. Architecting is in the word Tony Midler used last night, architecting the society.
Yeah, yeah.
And in a way, when you look at the tools, the representational techniques, what are available to him, what's in his frame of mind, and how does he project it onto this thing that's not necessarily architecture. So it's a way of, in a way, architecting that what is outside. And I wonder what the other side of that is. Is there, like, for instance, I'm thinking of Reclus, geographizing architecture. Or is that what I'm trying to ask is this kind of at this time in the discourses that you're looking at, is this a two-way exchange or a one-way exchange? Is it a one-way street or a two-way?
Yeah.
I don't know if it matters.
Yeah, no, I think it does matter. I think it's a great question. I'm just trying to think of the best way to answer it. I mean, I think my interest in that moment is really from the vantage point of the contemporary. I think that there's a danger of architecture becoming a monoculture in this contemporary moment, right? There is a way in which we have participated actively in the limiting of our own knowledge and expertise and abilities, and that I find incredibly troubling. And so part of the location of this as the first chapter of my book has to do with a desire to recoup all of the things we've given away as architects, all of the bodies of knowledge that we've now given over to specialization, allowed other people to take up, but trying to find a kind of critical moment that I could tell that narrative from. And so in Violet, what I saw was someone who occupied this kind of moment of epistemological specialization of the 19th century on the one hand, but who was trying so hard to exercise the architectural imagination to encompass everything. And so, for me, I love his dilemma because he's trying to hold on to all the things that university education and structure are jettisoning at that moment. And so I really identify with that struggle of trying to keep these. To make an argument that the architectural imagination has a place in things as disparate as geology and as disparate as climatology and as disparate as the autobiography. In that way, I guess too I am saying that I think in the 19th century, as a really general and probably stereotypical claim that I'm about to make, that it's becoming a one-way street. And that I'm interested in Violet specifically because he's trying to keep it from becoming a one-way street. Or he's struggling, a lot of people would look at this book and say, well, he's just trying to be an amateur scientist, but I think there are ways in which he's really exercising the architectural imagination, and that's not at all what he's trying to do. And so I don't know if that answers. Okay. But I like thinking about. I haven't thought about what the other side of that is, and you can bet I will tonight. Yeah.
When you were talking about the blood crystals in the slide,
Yeah.
and even about the double occupation, you kind of your chapter on tools.
Yeah.
It reminded me a lot of Don Heidi's work in expanding hermeneutics, and I was wondering if it could be said that architecture itself becomes a tool or technology that creates the material hermeneutic in the relationships of the I, technology, and world that he points out in his book.
Wow, it's a great question, and I love that you guys have students that are well versed in Don ID. Yeah, I think. So I've just finished my book prospectus, and one of the horrible things you have to do when you're writing a prospectus is like tell the publisher what your methodological orientation is. And I'm now wishing that you had been around asking that question when I was sadly trying to describe what I do methodologically, because I think my training is in hermeneutics and intellectual history, and so I'm really interested. I'm not sure about. I'm just trying on the label of material hermeneutics for size here, because I have not described myself or what I do according to that particular label. But I do think that the kind of the specific encounter with the object read closely in its context, but then opened up as a kind of hermeneutical horizon that allows me then to address the many different places where that possibility touches down is really a big part of my project. So maybe I'll have to give that as a provisional answer, but I'll be thinking of ID tonight and whether or not I would call myself a material hermeneuticist. But I think I like it.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have one more question,
Yeah,
sorry.
please, no problem.
So if we're talking about the laboratory, going to the structure of the book, and Latour says it in Kogi Thomas, which I think summarizes his work and kind of combines it together, that the accounting office is also a big part of it. And he gives the example of the grain at ore.
Yeah.
So where does that fit in? Is it in the architecture framework that you're bringing?
This is again, I mean, this is why the Ed Eigen piece that I shared with all of you, and Ed's been a really kind and generous about exchanging ideas and thoughts, and Ed's currently doing a book on. So what you all read was a kind of foray into his book on the development of the laboratory in France, and so that was like the early research that he was doing for that book, and so his discussion of the oikos and the notion of home economics being the kind of foundation of the laboratory, the management and distribution of home goods as being, it's really, for me, critical to understanding this question of the how and the what, because the management and preoccupation with management and distribution is in a way a preoccupation with the how, the question of the how, and that this is why the Bruno Latour quote that I started with about Boyle giving us the language of for modern conversations about nature, why I find it so frustrating, because like Latour's contribution as a scholar to me is in really interrogating the practices and habits of science, but I think there is also a way in which his work often elides the object of scientific encounter with the techniques and practices of science, and so I would answer it by saying that's where I try to differentiate, where I try to say here's where the how is eclipsing what it is that we're looking at, and I've learned a ton from the books of his that I've read, but I think consistently that is one of the things that the books tend to do, is to make the social scientific observation of laboratory practices themselves become the subject, right? And so that's part of what I'm saying has become the pernicious influence on the discipline of architecture. You know, like our students at Michigan are all reading Latour, and part of me is thinking, well, that's good, because there's a lot to be said about how he understands the relation of actor and actant, or but on the other hand, I find it incredibly worrisome, because you know, we're in a place that has like these unbelievable digital resources that are getting used sometimes simply to celebrate their prowess, and not because there is a kind of end game of what the architectural imagination can bring to them is. And so, I mean, that's sort of the inspiration for it. Other questions? Okay.
I have a question.
Sure.
Just a sort of practical question about how architecture practice was organized
Yeah.
at those times. Did it feel like Drew have his own firm, or did he receive, was there like were there architects from the government? How did it work?
Well, there's I can tell you a great book on this subject. This is not something that I am expert in, but Antoine Picon has written a book on French engineers. The book is about the foundations of the École Polytechnique, and the book interrogates how polytechnic education began. This institutional divide in the 19th century that I started with, and the notion that the education of the architect was either the purview of fine arts or was the purview of engineering. But what he does in his description in the book is to begin to really build different kind of habits of practice for engineers versus architects. And so you really begin to understand through his writing how those practices differed, and how, I mean, not so different from the argument that I'm trying to make with this set of images, how, for example, if you were trained in the École Polytechnique, when you saw a landscape and you were just simply representing that landscape in anticipation of some moment of engineering infrastructure that was going to be placed there, that even the way that they were drawing landscapes was really systematized according to how they would eventually carry out their practices. So it's this beautiful, I probably can't do much better than Picon does in that book, because it's a really beautiful kind of establishment of how the practices carry out. I mean, Violet is he's an interesting example, because his most of his life is spent doing these restoration projects too. So it's the that elastic imagination of the restoration architect is something that I'm particularly interested in, and I think it required the cultivation of seeing through things in a way that, which is why the dotted line became kind of fascinating to me, of seeing through what he was actually looking at, understanding the constructional logics and all of that. And so I would say that like those projects went on throughout most of his career, and those projects I would say really conditioned, you know, he was the restoration architect for Notre Dame Dijon. That was ongoing when he was doing this other work. And so there is a way in which simply trying to kind of document in a way the life of the building and that he was restoring also, I think, conditioned his architectural imagination in a really particular way. And that activity of a restoration architect, I think there's a different temporality to their imaginations. So those might be the two. You know, I'm not expert on the you know, the practice, the general practice of architects versus engineers in that period, but the Picon book does a really beautiful job of explaining. Yeah.
Something that I'm captivated by, maybe, I don't know if I have a concise question, but maybe you can just talk a little bit more about it, but this idea of being conditioned by the instrument,
Yeah,
and especially in terms of like where we are today, but also if we want to talk in terms of Ledoux and his experiments, was it when we're questioning what he was, whether he was a scientist or an architect and approaching this, I mean, is it the job of the architect to question the instrument or use the instrument to produce in that field? And so like it's really interesting this idea, like I wonder what our, I don't know what I want to call it, our crop image is today.
yeah, yeah,
And versus identifying what his was, might be able to, like whatever that black box is that delineates that circle, if that's what will tell us what his role was, whether it was some role of scientist or role of architect. But just this idea of being conditioned by the instrument, I think is something that I'd like to hear more about, or your thoughts on today's society, or us as architects today.
yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I'll have to do some speculating on my feet to answer it, but maybe I can tell you, well, part of the background to this, there's a really amazing landscape historian called John Dixon Hunt, who writes on the picturesque. And some of this thinking for me came out of reading John's work, where he talked about the use of the clawed glass in the picturesque landscape garden. And the clawed glass was essentially an accessory that was carried around in the picturesque gardens, and it opened up sort of like a woman's compact would open up, and it was seen as a kind of fashion accessory. So you had clawed glasses that were they might be amber tinted or rose tinted, and the notion was that you would find yourself in one of these picturesque gardens, and you would get to a prospect that was framed for you, and you would turn your back on the prospect and capture it in your clawed glass. So for me, again, this notion of immanent natures, of like appropriating or making nature a human contingency, John's writing was really critical in, for me, understanding what that was, or that moment of the clawed glass, capturing it and personalizing it in your own fashion accessory was really critical to that. And so I was trying to bring that into the 19th century and say, well, where does it manifest there? And the Daston and Gallison's book that I mentioned does a really beautiful job of unpacking the fact that we make that we make certain assumptions about how we think science operates. And so, that you all thought it was funny when I said, well, the guy who did the snowflake atlas just threw out all the abnormal snowflakes. They describe that as like a paradigm of scientific thought in the 19th century that belongs to the atlas. But we would make different assumptions. And so part of it was just being interested in the assumptions that we make with the tool and how we extend its instrumentality. So there's the old aphorism of, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think that this belongs in part to that, but it's something different too, right? Because it's conditioning everything we see. And so if I were to sort of cull from my experience in studio and say, like, what do I see as being some of those things? I would say, for example, that you are a scaleless generation. Like the zoom tool on your computer, in a way, has conditioned you to not be attuned to scale. Right, like that moment isn't a dimensional moment on your computer screen, and so like that for me that would be one of those moments of an instrumentality that conditions your spatial encounter, because you're not thinking scale in that moment. I mean another set of clues that I teach a graduate seminar on tools. And so another set of tools that are clues that I'm really interested in. I don't know what to call these, but I often use the example with my students of Rosie, the Jetsons robot. Do you guys know Rosie? So like this big mechanical box that like comes out and like this hatch door opens and she's got this, you know, hand with a dust plume. But she's always got the French maid's apron and little frilly cap on. And there is a way in which we produce a kind of continuity in our tools, right, that allows us to still identify, like, here's this piece of then cutting edge technology, but still masquerading as a French maid. And so as a category of tools, I'm really interested in those moments where something's carried over. So your desktop icon, the hand icon, right? One could argue that those are moments that somehow produce an instrumentality, because the hand icon doesn't work like your hand works, and the desktop on your computer isn't anything like the desktop that I write on, right? It's a different operation. And so those things all come with conditioned instrumentalities too, right? With how you grab something, how you move it on your desktop, what the, so I'm rambling a little bit, but those would be places where I would start to locate, you know, generationally what, I mean, I should throw this question back at you all really, because you probably have a better sense, given the tools that you use, what some of those operational biases start to be, and how the instrumentality is extended. Whoops. Okay.
So what we will stop for a moment, and if Amy has the energy, we'll pick up again with the few projects left in Gina's section presentation, and a lot of these questions will come up again.